Hey guys, welcome to Fall 2023 Biology 111. My particular section, I am Dr. G. This is online biology, and I will apologize for the handwriting right off the bat. It probably won't get any better. So let's get right into it. A couple of housekeeping things, right? I know you guys are taking it online, but here's my stuff, what I do, where I am, right? You can find me, oh crap, already. You can find me in room N203J. That's the Natural Sciences Building. If you are able to come see me, you're more than welcome to. My office hours are listed right underneath my room location. Probably for you online guys, the best way to get in touch with me, is through email. I'll do my best to respond within 24 hours, right? And you are welcome if I'm in my office to give me a call. That's my phone extension. And so, what do you need to complete this course, right? Access to McGraw-Hill homework assignments, and there may be also a couple of virtual labs, but it's McGraw-Hill Connect, and so this is inclusive access. You paid for it at registration. I'm pretty sure all you have to do is click on the first homework assignment, and that'll get you started, right? Don't have to enter any codes or do anything like that. One of the common questions is, do I need to buy the book? Well, the inclusive access you'll see in the bottom right corner of that web page when you navigate to it, right? That gives you access to the electronic e-text, although that will expire when the semester ends. So if you actually want the physical book going forward past this semester, then I suggest you look on Amazon. The IBN number is listed in the course syllabus document. But you do get e-text with your inclusive access, and that seems to serve the needs of most. The lab, that's going to be completed virtually, and that's usually where we do run into some hiccups. That is through the HOL people, which is short for hands-on lab. There is a link in the on the Blackboard site, right? It'll take you to that website. You need to register, right, for the website, and then you need to look back in your email. Look for an inclusive access email. Inclusive. Wow, that's terrible. It should have all your course information that has inclusive access. That'll give you the what you need to get registered for the site, and then you need to redeem your kit code voucher, which should be in that inclusive access email. There is a web link in the lab document that will walk you through how to do that, because you got to redeem that kit code voucher to get the kit sent to you that you will need to complete some of the virtual labs. Okay, now some of those labs will be completed on the website. Some of them will be through Blackboard handouts. You may or may not need components of your lab kit to complete some of those Blackboard handouts, but those will be designated in the lab schedule document as either HOL, which means you have to navigate to the website, or BB for Blackboard, which means you will have a Blackboard handout. All labs will be submitted back to those assignment links in either a Word file or a PDF file format, because those are the two that are easiest to open for me. So please don't send Mac files, because I have to convert those, right? I left some instructions in the Blackboard lab assignments folder about how to convert documents. So hopefully that'll help. And then last thing, as far as housekeeping goes, is the enrollment verification quiz. You will find that in the Start Here section on our Blackboard course. That is for the registration people. It's basically what I call a syllabus quiz, because all the questions I pulled from the course information and schedule documents. And so that needs to be completed by August 29th to maintain your standing in the class. So make sure you get that done. Also, make sure to use the two things that are pretty important are the calendar and the announcements section. I will do my best to remind you guys when things are due, right? Today is actually Monday. As soon as I finish constructing these audio lectures, I will send out an announcement that will give you an idea of what's going to be due this coming Sunday, and we'll kind of get in a routine. So with that being said, right, we'll get right into it. Chapter 1, pretty much define biology, talk a bit about a few historical perspectives, and then we'll talk about the scientific method. And so the book, outline is subdivided into 4 sections. Characteristics of life, talking a little bit about evolution, the process of science, which mainly can just pretty much be recharacterized as the scientific method, and then a few things about science and the challenges facing society today. So biology, the study of life. What is life? Well, we try to define that through a couple different ways, because in microbiology we can definitely get into discussion about viruses. Are they living or are they dead? But here's what we say: they actively maintain an organized complexity. We'll talk about the 2 derivations of cells, which are either prokaryotes or eukaryotes. We'll talk about that a little bit later. How they acquire and use materials and energy, right? Photosynthesis versus metabolism. And then, probably the easiest way to characterize that is when we talk about this is pretty much we are carbon-based life forms. So, do you make your own carbon? Are you an autotroph? Or do you have to eat somebody that makes their own carbon, meaning you're a heterotroph? And then can you sense and respond to stimuli, right? And pretty much the way I like to look at that is, are you environmentally aware? And can you grow? And can you reproduce? And obviously, both of these characteristics are inherently related to the other characteristic is, can you evolve? Can you adapt to your surroundings? And can you adapt to changing surroundings? And so, if biology is the study of life, obviously there's great diversity among living things. There are hundreds of thousands of different species of organisms that compose what we call living things. But mainly all living things can be pretty much roughly grouped into organic or carbon-based life forms, at least on this planet. And so carbon acquisition obviously is important, and also, the ability to convert inorganic substances to organic substances. That's one of the things that happens with photosynthesis, right? You take carbon dioxide from the air, which is an inorganic substance, and then you convert that solar energy to chemical energy in the form of carbon-based bonds and sugars, such as glucose, right? So inorganic to organic cycling is another way to look at it. Another good example there is nitrogen. Plants need nitrogen. Well, nitrogen gas is present in the air, and that's an inorganic substance, but they have little bacteria living in their roots that undergo the process of nitrogen fixation and convert that to an organic molecule that the plants can use. So cycling is a big part of life, so to speak. And living things are also going to obey the same physical and chemical laws that govern everything else in the universe, which is probably self-evident. But despite all this diversity, all living things share the same basic characteristics, which we described in that last slide. From the tiniest bacteria up until the whale, right? They all share the ability to survive, grow, reproduce, have a metabolism, and respond to their environment. So how is life organized? Obviously, the simplest level of organization is the atom, right? And the cell is the basic unit of structure and function of living things. And so we know that atoms become molecules. Molecules organize into macromolecules, and those are the building blocks for the cell, right? And living things can be unicellular or multicellular, right? As we're going to find, most of the prokaryotes that we'll talk about, the simpler of the 2 cell organizations, they are all unicellular. Whereas in the eukaryotic world, which is a little bit more cellularly complicated, right, you can have both unicellular and multicellular examples. But, oh crap, I ran out of room. Unicellular examples. I told you guys the handwriting, not good, right? But the idea is this is kind of a hierarchical structure or a hierarchy, whereas each level of organization is more complex than the level preceding it, right? So, so as you can see here, we go up to the atom, We go up to the molecule, and then I kind of like to throw macromolecules in there, right? And then you have cells, and cells with the common characteristics and that have a similar function can organize into tissues. Tissues can organize to function as an organ, and then organs form organ systems. For example, the digestive system, right? That's your stomach, your duodenum, your colon. So you got three different organs there functioning together into one system, and then several organ systems will organize themselves into an organism, right? So as you can see, the basic premise of this slide is complexity increases, okay? And then that continues, right? I, we got up to this part with the organism. I know the type here is pretty small, right? But we go up from organism to species. These are organisms with similar characteristics that also breed or interbreed, right? And then they form a population, which is an organism of the same species that lives in a particular area, right? And then the community, the different populations that interact in a certain area, and then that forms an ecosystem, right? The community, all the different populations that are in an environment, and the physical environment, and then those different ecosystems form the biosphere, which is essentially our planet. So, I won't belabor and read these next couple of slides to you because I pretty much defined those, right? But for those of you who like the text version, there they are, from starting from a biosphere down to the species level, and then from the organism down to the atom. And so with organisms, they must have a metabolism. They must have a way of not only acquiring energy, but utilizing energy. And so energy obviously is the capacity to do work, right? And so metabolism is the sum of all the chemical reactions that occur in the cell. And we generally divide those into two categories. We say anabolic reactions, those are building block reactions, the cell's actually making something, and those actually require energy. And then we've got catabolic reactions. Those are actually breakdown reactions. And in general, those release or yield energy. And so the metabolism is the sum of all the catabolic and anabolic reactions that occur in a cell. And so the sun obviously is the ultimate source of energy for nearly all life on Earth, because plants use energy from the sun, right, in conjunction with carbon dioxide, pretty much to make sugars, for lack of a better term. And that for that reason, they are considered autotrophic, right? They make their own carbon. And for those of us that can't photosynthesize, we consume the plants, acquire our carbon in that way. And for that reason, most organisms, other than the photosynthetic guys, are considered heterotrophic, right? Hetero with the prefix meaning different, right? Depending on the type of plant you eat, you're acquiring your carbon, whereas auto, the prefix self, right? You're making your own carbon. And so ecosystems in general are characterized by chemical cycling and energy flow, right? Hakuna Matata, right? The great circle of life. Chemicals are not used up when organisms die. And so chemicals can move from one population to another in a food chain, right? So the producers, which is another way to look at another way to characterize the autotrophs, right? They produce the carbon that the consumers or the heterotrophs utilize. And then what happens when one of those animals die? It's broken down by the decomposers, and essentially those nutrients return from whence they came, dust to dust and all that good stuff. Okay? So energy from the sun flows through plants and other members of the food chain as one population feeds on another, right? So therefore, it all starts with the plants, right? There has to be a constant input of solar energy, which that's pretty much what this simplistic slide is trying to show you. The thing I want to draw your attention on is most of these are inefficient systems, and a great deal of energy is lost as heat. And when we get into more about biological systems and chemical reactions, we'll talk about how that happens, right? But very little energy actually gets utilized to do work. Most of it is lost in the form of heat. which we're going to talk about in our planet, can be a problem that we're going to be facing in the coming decades and centuries. All organisms also must maintain a homeostasis, right? Which is pretty much, I call it the yin and the yang, right? Basically, the way I look at it is your catabolic reactions have to produce enough energy or release enough energy to power all your anabolic reactions. So there's got to be a balance there, right? Whatever you break down, you've got to be able to use that energy, feed it into something else that you can build, right? So you can't build without available energy. So that's kind of the way I look at homeostasis, is the balance between catabolic and anabolic reactions. Then on a larger scale, organisms also going to have homeostasis with its environment, right? And be able to respond to changes that environment. And the ability to respond often produces movement or migration, which changes ecosystems and hopefully leads to adaptations. In addition, all organisms must reproduce. I will often say that's the goal of every organism, is to survive and reproduce, but they must reproduce to maintain a population. Now, when we talk about reproduction, mainly the two main forms of that are either asexual or sexual, both viable means of reproduction, but obviously, as we're going to find later on this semester, sexual reproduction and leads to increased genetic diversity, right? Which hopefully leads to adaptations, which then hopefully help the ability to reproduce. And so when the organisms reproduce, they pass on copies of their genetic information, genes. A gene is a sequence of DNA that actually is transcribed and hopefully translated into a protein. And so obviously these genes collectively are going to determine the characteristics of an organism. And genes are composed of DNA. And what we're going to learn as we go through this semester, when DNA undergoes mutations, which is essentially changes in the DNA sequence, then that can produce new genes, which in turn may or may not produce new properties, which in turn may or may not produce adaptations. And so obviously evolution is the change in a population of organisms over time to become more suited to the environment. So evolution is driven by adaptations, and adaptations are driven by mutations, right? And so mutations are driven by selective pressures, right? Which then could be referred to as a changing environment. You probably heard the phrase adapt or die, right? I think the Marines like that one, but it is true in terms of organism. And so in 1858, you can see from this newspaper article how this was well received. But Darwin, and in a separate paper, his colleague Wallace proposed that all species are related by a common ancestry. Now, this went directly in the face of religious thinkings, which was that God created the heavens and the earth and all the organisms on it. But Darwin and Wallace all proposed that the characteristics of species can be modified from generation to generation, which they called descent with modification, which basically was the process that evolution went through. And Darwin published these findings in his famous paper famous paper book, whatever you want to call it, The Origin of Species. And so there's a lot of history behind that, which we won't have time to get into, but essentially, evolution through Darwin's eyes was driven by natural selection, right? Organisms that were better adapted to survive and reproduce would then also have an advantage passing their genes on to the next generation and eventually become the dominant population in a community through their acquired adaptations. And so evolution pretty much explains the diversity, not only the diversity, but also the unity of life. But ascribing to this theory pretty much implies that everything evolved from a common ancestor, the common descent with modification. You'll sometimes hear this common ancestor referred to as LUCA, right, which is short for last universal common ancestor. And so with evolutionary theory, right, with every theory, you've got to have both a pattern and a mechanism. So evolutionary theory is based on two patterns, that all species are related by a common ancestry, and the characteristics of a species can be modified from generation to generation. Now, this is not a new idea. It just was put in a clarified form, right? And the process or mechanism was what we call natural selection. Pretty much the idea that the environment is going to control or is going to affect the ability to survive and reproduce. So any organism that is more adapted to an environment is going to be able to survive and then reproduce more, and then eventually become the dominant population. And so the aspect that we want to talk about with natural selection is that some aspect of the environment selects which traits are going to be more apt to be passed on to the next generation. For example, squirrels that live in a forest, right? You can envision camouflage is important for them to hide from predators. So those that have, brownish fur, so to speak, are going to blend in the environment much easier than those that have white fur, right? Those are going to get picked off because they're going to be highly visible to predators such as owls, right? But you can imagine if the environment shifted to more of a beach-like environment from the forest, not only are those squirrels going to have to find new means of food acquisition, but also those brown guys are going to stick out like sore thumbs on the white beach sand, whereas the white guys, right, are going to blend in more and be protected from predators. And so where did that white fur come from? Well, actually, it came from a mutation in one of the fur pigment producing genes, right? And in the forest environment, that was selected against, but in the beach environment, that would be selected for. So, fitness, obviously the ability of an individual to produce offspring, and then adaptation is a trait that increases the fitness of an individual in a particular environment. And so a group of individuals of the same species living in the same area that probably are going to have the same adaptations constitute a population. And so the key point that I always remember to show this slide, because you're like, why is this dude repeating himself? This is the key point, right? Natural selection acts on individuals, but evolutionary change occurs in populations. For example, go back to our squirrel example. Mutation, which is natural selection, led to a mutation in that guy's pigment production genes, which led to a white coat, right? So the mutation occurred in the individual, but when the environment shifted from the forest to the beach, that environmental shift selected for that particular adaptation and allowed him to have an advantage surviving and reproducing, and then therefore, right, he becomes eventually the dominant population. Same with penguins, right? These guys live in the Arctic. Oh, where'd my pen go? Hang on. Ink color. All right. Everything that these guys, well, crap. Where did my pen go? Hang on, guys. Sorry. Hang with me. You'd think after 20 odd years, there we go. I get the hang of this. Everything this guy has is adaptations to live in his environment. In an ocean environment that can be as low as minus 50 degrees at some point, right? So pretty much what do they have? Well, they have heavy, solid bones, right? Kind of like you guys have ever been scuba diving. What's one of the things that you have to wear when you scuba dive? You have to wear a weight belt, right, to keep you equilibrated to stay at certain depths underwater, right? Well, these guys have heavy, solid bones that act like a diver's weight belt that allow them to stay underwater. Paddle-like flippers, right? You can see those here. A short wedge-shaped tail, which kind of makes them a little bit more aerodynamic. Short legs with webbed feet, right? Because most of the time they're going to be spent in the water, right? So they need those flippers more than they need those legs. And then also for these guys, especially with emperor penguins, 2 layers of feathers plus a layer of what they call blubber, which is a huge layer of fat, right? Which allows them to live in those Arctic conditions, right? They even, if you compare these types of penguins to other penguins found in slightly warmer environments, they even have shorter bills, more slender aerodynamic bills, which are supposed to minimize heat loss. But everything designed to living in a frigid aquatic environment. And so when we talk about life and we talk about how diverse it is, how do we organize that diversity? And one of the ways that we do that is through taxonomy, right? Which is pretty much the science of naming, okay? And with taxonomy, we name according to certain rules. And early taxonomy was pretty much based on physical shared characteristics. And modern taxonomy or phylogeny is based on molecular sequence relationships. How related are DNA sequences of two different organisms? And we'll talk about how that shaped modern day domain classifications. And then systematics is the study of evolutionary relationships between organisms. And so we usually characterize these guys into species, which is the least inclusive, which seems kind of counterintuitive, but the way this slide is worded, right? They're very closely related to the most inclusive category, which is the domain, which would have several species and genus within a single classification. And so generally this works from most inclusive or least inclusive to most inclusive, species being the most specific and domain being the most general or least specific. And so how do we do that, right? Well, let's start with the two basic ones, right? This was based on Linnaean taxonomy, which was developed in the 1700s by a guy named Carlos von Linnaeus, right? One thing to understand is in early times, the language of the educated was Latin, right? A lot of medical terminology is based on Latin root words. And so Linnaeus developed what we call the binomial nomenclature, in which he proposed each organism have a genus species characterization, with a genus being a closely related group of species, and then the species being a distinct, identifiable type of organism that has characteristics different from the other species and that tends to breed together. For example, we belong to the genus species, which constitutes the scientific name. We belong to the group Homo sapiens. Sapiens is particular to just humans, right? Whereas Homo is a genus that includes other primate members with opposable thumbs, right? Um, and Linnaeus was famous for saying "Inocu vito numen adest," which is live righteously. The deity is present. I always like to change that to live righteously. The wife is present, right? But I digress. Okay. So Linnaean taxonomy eventually led to this kind of characterization, and we'll use us kind of as a guinea pig here, right? Species being humans, right? And then the genus Homo, that also includes our Neanderthal predecessors, right? Going up to the family Homidae, which includes certain species of primates, then moving up to the order primates, which pretty much includes everybody with opposable thumbs, going up to the class Mammalia, which is the warm-blooded guys, right? Up to the phylum Chordata, which is everybody with a backbone. Finally, up to the kingdom Animalia, which you'll see has got the turtle in it and got some flying members in it, right? So least specific to most specific. The problem with Linnaeus' system is he proposed two kingdoms, um, only plants and animals, right? And that created some problems when we later discovered that there were two different cell types. And so from a cell type standpoint, cells can be subdivided into either prokaryotes or eukaryotes. And roughly, pro is the prefix before. Karyon is the Greek word for nut or kernel, whereas eu is the prefix for after. And once again, that word karyon, after nut or kernel. And so essentially the big difference between prokaryotes and eukaryotes is membrane-bound organelles like a nucleus, right? The presence of intracellular membrane-bound organelles. Eukaryotes have them and prokaryotes don't. But what that means is, do prokaryotes have no intracellular storage compartments? They do, right? But they're just not lipid bilayer based compartments, which is by definition what an organelle is. An intracellular membrane bound, in this case, the membrane being a lipid bilayer based compartment. So the nucleus would be an example of an organelle, mitochondria, the endoplasmic reticulum. These would be all organelles that are found in eukaryotes. Prokaryotes may have what we call storage or inclusion bodies, and these tend to be very simplified storage structures, which will either be a single lipid layer as their membrane or a protein-based membrane. So it's not fair to say they don't have anything in their cytoplasm, but they're not by definition organelles, so to speak. And so this led to what became popular in the 60s, the five kingdom classification, which allowed for the prokaryotes. They threw them all in the kingdom Monera, which is essentially the bacteria and the archaea, the extremophiles. And then they also developed the kingdom Protista, which was all eukaryotic but had some both unicellular and multicellular members. Then they subdivided the fungi from the plants and the animals because essentially, as we're going to find, fungi have both animal and plant properties. But, the debate raged on. There was even at several times a 3, a 4, a 6, and an 8 kingdom classification. The key point here is all these classification systems up until this point were based on observable characteristics, what we call visible phenotypes, things that they could see or observe. And modern day classification refers on DNA sequence characterizations. And Woese proposed this with the advent of PCR in the early 1970s, that if adaptation is driven by mutation, and mutation is the changes in the DNA sequence, then he correctly proposed that obviously the more sequence related the DNA of one organism is to another, the more related those organisms are to each other. Meaning the less change that occurs in a DNA sequence over time, the more related those DNA sequences would be to each other. And so a lot of these phylogenetic sequence classifications are based on what they call ribosomal RNA sequences. And ribosomal RNA makes up components of the ribosomes, which are responsible for protein translation, which all cells must have, both prokaryotes and eukaryotes. And so when we think about selecting for or against new traits, once again, it's pretty simple, right? You always have to consider the environment. And I know this slide seems out of place, but I wanted to throw it back in there to remind you of what is actually determining the relatedness. The environment, which leads to the adaptations, which leads to dominant populations. For example, looking at this demographic here, this slide here, we see all these different leaf morphologies, either smooth or a rough leaf structure, right? Well, deer prefer a diet of smooth leaves over hairy leaves, so they eat up all the smooth leaves. Well, if you're a leaf, you don't want to get eaten, right? So you would like to not get eaten. Therefore, if you're a hairy leaf, you don't get eaten. So over time, both the selective pressure provided by the preferred deer diet and natural selection through adaptation, we see most of the leaves become hairy as the smooth leaves are actually selected against, right? So all of these relationships are driven by selective pressure. And so when you look at these phylogenetic trees, these areas are called branch points or nodes. And this is where a divergence occurred, meaning two species split into one, right? So the closer you are on these trees, the more related you are. The further away you are, right, the less related you are. So bacteria, which are actually closely related to archaea, are not very similar to animals, as you would expect, right? So when you read these, right, everything started from a common ancestor. That would be our Luca. And then sometime early on, right, Luca split into what eventually evolved into the bacteria and the archaea. And then it's thought because archaea have similar outer membrane compositions to some eukaryotes, it's also thought at some time in their evolutionary point, and you can see this would be later in time because it's further along the tree here, right? So this would be after the prokaryotic archaea split, right? You got a cell with a nucleus, right, which eventually became the eukarya, and then eventually, right, we had development into protists, and then the split, which led to the plants, and then later on, um, a split that led to the fungi and the animal derivations, right? So those are the way that's the way you read those phylogenetic trees, right? Closer you are, the more related you are, and a time frame involves at least a rough approximation over time of when they split. So so the derivation between fungi and animals would actually be the most recent split in this phylogenetic tree, where the split into the bacteria and the archaea would be the oldest split if we're reading that tree. And so I think this is going to be a good place to stop, right? This will constitute chapter 1, part 1, right? So I'll put this slide back up to reemphasize, right? Taxonomy. Here's another way to briefly look at it, right? Taxonomy is naming, systematics is characterizing. And you can see it's split here as it shows, right? We as Homo sapiens are part of the domain Eukarya. And I put this slide up to remember new thinking has led to the development of these supergroups, right? Which are, they're only present in the domain Eukarya. And these are organisms with the idea is they share common characteristics, and so they're kind of in between. A lot of them, they seem to be taking the place of the kingdom phylum thing. It's a more general characterization, right? But I think there are 4 super groups at present, and they're talking about making a couple more, right? So it's somewhere between the domain and the kingdom classification, which we've already went through from animals down to the species level. Okay, so that's a good stopping point. We'll pick up on the next slide, which I think will be slide number 44. Start talking a little bit more about domains with chapter 1, part 2.